Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And we're going to continue forward today with episode 6 of the shop vlog, part 2 of this episode, where I'm editing a guest artist's image, independent of their vision, putting my artistic process on top of it to create a piece of artwork. In part 1, we went through the process of exploring the image in Adobe Camera Raw, then took it into Photoshop and went through the retouching process of frequency separation, dodging and burning, enhancing the eyes, and techniques of blending a snake skin texture to the skin of the model. Now today in part 2, we're going to explore the composite that I've created, showing you all the different layers, the techniques, and the process that went into its creation. Before we dive into Photoshop, I'd like to introduce the two artists that are involved in the image making of the original image. First and foremost, my wonderful friend Brad Campbell, who's the photographer. He's a wonderful friend of mine. We've known each other for a very long time. He has incredible, unique visions, and I was very proud to work on this image of his. And then of course the model and talent and the image is my friend Evie, who is a force to be reckoned with. She's incredibly creative and very wonderfully talented. I've only been able to work with her one time in person. It's been a dream to work with her that one time, and I look forward to new adventures where I can capture my own images of her. But being able to work on this image that she and Brad captured together is a dream come true. It's a blast to work with. So with that being said, let's dive into Photoshop and begin the journey of part 2 of episode 6 of the shop vlog. Every time I look at this image, it's so creepy. It's like horrifically creepy, but interesting, and I want to look at it, but I don't. And that's not a statement about me and what I've done with this. This is a statement about Brad and Evie and the art that they have created with the original image. They bring so much to the table as artists. They're a powerhouse together. They've worked together for a very long time. Evie brings a lot of resources and props and ideas to all the shoots that she does. Brad has worked very hard as a photographer to continue to expand his skill set and bring his visions to life. And I love seeing what the two of them produce. It's wonderful to see it, and it's wonderful to be able to work on it. So let's start looking at this composite and all the layers that went into it. I said this in part 1. I'm going to say it again, that I want to preface that anything that I say that's like, oh, well, I would have done it this way, or I chose to change the image to this, that's not a disparaging comment toward Brad and Evie and their artistic work and their vision. It's just giving you the understanding of what I choose to do. And you've let me know in the comments of the previous episodes of the shop vlog that this is something that you would like to see and be able to follow my artistic process. So that's why I will make those comments. Again, it's not meant as a reflection on Brad and Evie, just a statement of purpose of what I'm doing. So looking at this composite, let's start with the very first layer here. This is a piece of stock that I purchased from Adobe Stock. I went there and typed in 3D snakes because I figured that would give me the best results instead of looking for a picture of a real snake. Just FYI, I don't like snakes. Snakes creep me out. I've never cared for snakes. And so going through Adobe Stock and looking at pictures of snakes, I was like, man, I'm never going to sleep. I'm just going to have to drink booze. And as I landed on this image, I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's it perfectly for 2 reasons. Number 1, the emotional impact. It makes me uncomfortable. Looking at this, I'm like, oh, don't, just get off. No, go wash. I don't like it at all. So first, it had the emotional impact that gave me what I needed. But number 2, from a design perspective, this is the perfect piece of stock to use for this. Now in part 1, when I talked about making a composite, I was like, maybe I'll put a cobra head behind her, or buildings that are indicative of Greece to play up the idea of Medusa. And I could certainly went in that direction. That would have been fine. But I wanted to create this abstract graphic image. As I said in part 1, I want the audience to go to her eyes. Evie is the story. And so I wanted anything else that goes into the composite to support that story, not fight against it. So a cobra head or buildings in the background, yes, that could technically support the story, but that could be something that pulls our focus and tells a different story, and that's not what I wanted. So when I saw this, it creeped me out. It had the emotional impact, and it was benign enough that it would supplement the story of Evie, not take away. And mainly because we don't see the head of a snake. We don't have eyes that we can connect to. So the only eyes that we see are Evie's. So therefore the audience, we're predisposed to look for eyes and images and want to connect to it. The eyes are the windows to the soul. So therefore, in this case, this piece of stock works perfectly and will not fight against the story. So once I brought it into the document, then I made a Hue Saturation Adjustment layer here to simply change all of the green and cyans that we see into this to red. So I clipped a Hue Saturation Adjustment layer to it, went to the cyans and the blues, and changed those hues to be red. The next thing I did was to bring in a texture. Now this texture is also a texture that I purchased from Adobe stock, and I love using this texture in almost anything that I create. It's got wonderful texture into it, and the colors inside of it are white, black, and gray, so it works really well with layer blending modes to pull it into the scene. And what I did was ultimately bring it in, and I wanted to start creating this hazy, foggy illusion. And not necessarily like real fog, but I wanted it to make it hard to see the snakes. Your imagination will create more horrific stuff than what you actually see. So one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite sci-fi horror films is the original Alien with Sigourney Weaver and Tom Skerritt. I love that movie. It terrified me when I saw it when I was younger because you never get a full glimpse of the alien until the very end of the film. So the whole movie, your imagination is building it up to be this monster, and then you finally see it and hopefully it matches what you build in your imagination. I wanted to do the same thing with this texture. I wanted the idea that there's this mass of writhing snakes, and the core of it is just beyond our field of view. So that 3 or 4 of them are kind of rising up and out of it, and that just creeps me out. And so I added the texture for that reason. However, the texture by itself is pretty bright, and the stock image is relatively bright. I mean, there's a lot of black in it, of course, especially on the outer perimeter edges up here, but it's relatively bright. So to augment that, I made a solid color adjustment layer here that's filled with black and changed the blending mode to soft light so that it would instantaneously make everything darker significantly. Now, there's other ways you can do this, like exposure adjustment layers, levels adjustment layers, all that kind of stuff. I like using solid color adjustment layers set to black on soft light because it still lets you see everything. It just makes everything significantly darker very quickly. But then I took it away using this layer mask. Anywhere where it's painted black, it's missing and being taken away. I took it away from the outer extreme perimeter edge because in the original stock piece from Adobe of the snakes, there isn't anything up in here. So I just wanted to lessen that just a little bit. We didn't need to have that there. Then the next section of the composite is the first time that I brought Evie into play into the piece. Now I put this into a group. This layer here is the layer that I produced at the end of part 1 with the retouch. I went ahead and used a layer mask to ultimately start feathering away the extreme edge of the image because she went out of frame in Brad's original image, so I had a hard line at the bottom of it. I needed to feather that away, and I used a custom haze brush that I made in Photoshop so it would have that smoky, abstract, foggy pattern. That's the same that we see in the texture and so forth working in the scene. I'm trying to use the same techniques, the same ways of telling the story. So not only the idea of fog, but the brush that I use to work on masks has that same feeling. It's a connective through line of creativity that builds up throughout the entire piece. So I brought Evie into play with this layer mask to fade that away, and then I added an exposure adjustment layer and clipped it to her. Now I talked about this in part 1. The lighting pattern that Brad used, there was at least 2 lights into the scene, and the strongest light, the main light, was coming in from camera right. There was a second one coming in from camera left that was illuminating Evie's right side, or the left side of her body, camera left side of her body. I use this exposure adjustment layer. This is the original illumination of the layer, and I use the exposure adjustment layer to darken her up on this side. My favorite lighting patterns are Rembrandt lighting and butterfly lighting because ultimately it uses highlight and shadow to sculpt and tell the story of the subject. It creates a sense of drama, and it's something I've always liked in the photography artwork that I do. And so I use this exposure adjustment layer to ultimately be able to recreate that and bring it in. So I use the layer mask here. Anywhere where it's painted white, it's been revealed. So ultimately under her arms and on the camera left side, she's got some more shadow play here on her arms, up top, underneath her arms, here in her armpit, and so forth. We're just adding those shadows to make a sense of that drama of the light pattern as it's traveling from camera right and moving across the scene itself. So once I had created that, the layer of Evie with the layer mask and the exposure adjustment layer, I made a composite layer of just those two by selecting them and hitting Control, Alt, and E, or Command, Option, and E on a Mac. And it makes one solitary layer of that, which is this layer here in the layer stack. Now I'm going to turn that one on, but I want to explain these 3 because it can be a little bit complex. So once I had made this layer, which is a composite layer of Evie, I turned off this group. Then I duplicated this layer 2 times. started with this one, and I did a blend if. So I'm going to turn this layer on. And as you can see, the layer, it does have a layer mask, but if we look, anywhere where it's painted black is being taken away. I just took out the outer perimeter edge of her right arm. I wound up actually undoing this with one of these extra layers here in the layer stack, but I'll explain that here in just a moment. The blend if, even though we can see the entire layer, almost the entire layer, the blend if lets the background come up and through. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to double click on the layer anywhere where there's not any writing, a layer mask or the thumbnail of it, and that will open the layer style window. And here is the blend if option. So what I did was I said for this layer of Evie, I want the underlying layers, which is the snakes, the texture, and everything else to come up and through, starting with the darkest points of them, which is the shadows. And as I split this little triangle and start moving this triangle to the right, it's moving through the midtones, the gray area, up toward the highlights. More and more of the darkness will come up and through. So we get the result of being able to see the snake texture through her arm. The snakes at the base of this piece here, coming up and through her dress, up and through the sword, up and around, because again, my original intent with this was to create this abstract feeling that she's floating amongst these snakes. I did not want composite realism where I had to make sure her arms were in front of them and they went behind her properly and the right corresponding highlights and shadows and all that kind of stuff. This is more of an abstract graphic piece instead of realism. So by using blend if and letting those snakes come up and through, we really get that feeling and effect. But we need to be able to see strategic key parts of her, like her face and her eyes and other parts. So that's where these duplicate layers come into play. The next duplicate is preserved. There's no blend if on this whatsoever. So the original layer is full in its intent. I put a black mask or a hide all mask onto it and then painted white onto the mask to reveal the full layer of Evie. And I painted it on her face, her hair, on the hands, on the sword. I went all the way down the shaft of the sword so that we could really make sure to see that and let it come into play. They chose to use the sword as a prop. I wanted to preserve that in this piece. The last copy of Evie, that layer that I composited together, I simply took this one into Adobe Camera Raw and reduced the highlights, the white point, the exposure, and brought it down. Again, a further stretch to try to change the lighting pattern. So if we look at this, here's the original illumination of her face. And then with this layer turned on, I'm just adding a little bit more shadow in key areas and letting the original illumination be a dodge in the scene, again, in key areas to play up the skeletal structure of her face and just bringing in some more of that drama and so forth. But it was also on this layer. Initially, I had just painted white onto the layer mask itself to bring it in on her face and her eyes and so forth. But it is this layer where I then decided to go for composite realism. So I brought her arms back entirely, but with the reduced opacity of the highlights and shadows and so forth by running the layer through Camera Raw. Because I wanted her arms to be in front of the snakes here and here through her bicep and her shoulder, but then let the snakes kind of fade through in this fog. So there's a little bit of composite realism, there's a little bit of abstract graphic elements to this, and this is where this blank layer here in the layer stack comes into play. I just simply added a shadow under this arm so that it would be a little bit more believable, because here there's already enough of a shadow down there that it's fine. Her elbow is not directly in front of one of the snakes, but here it was, so I added just a blank layer and painted black at a very low flow to create that shadow. Then I decided to add a texture on top of everything. This texture is a wonderful texture that I, again, purchased from Adobe. It's got all this crackle in it and blood and whatever else, and it's just gross by itself. And so I thought, why not? We'll put it into the scene. So I brought it into this piece, and then I just simply used a layer mask here, painting black on the layer mask to take it away from her face, her neck, her hands, mainly her skin, so that we would not see all that crackling texture into it. It would just be everywhere else in the document except her face and her skin. Then I clipped a blank layer to it and I simply painted just a little bit of white at a low flow of like 3% using that custom haze brush that I made in Photoshop down here on the edges. I wanted to just fill in those darker spots just a little bit up here too, where it was empty from the original stock image from Adobe of the snakes. I just wanted to add something into there, and using the haze brush worked beautifully with everything that I had already created. Then once that was done, I made a composite layer at the top of the layer stack of everything. Then I right-clicked this layer and went to Duplicate Layer, chose a new document, and then made this layer a document all by itself. And then I went back to this one and saved this as a Photoshop document to preserve all of these layers. This is my practice when I make a composite. I essentially make a living document is what I call it, and then save it. I don't like to use the first document where I build the entire composite. I don't like to make a composite layer at the top and then start adding a bunch of adjustment layers to color grade it and do the artistic process. It makes the file really big. There's a lot of margin and error if the file gets corrupted and all that kind of stuff. I like having that living document and then just making a new one and starting the artistic process. And then I finalized it doing my creative work as an artist, using adjustment layers, focusing on the fundamentals of Photoshop that I've talked about all the time: color, luminosity, and detail. I focused on those three elements, using adjustment layers to address all of that, working with complementary colors that are already in the scene, putting reds and yellows and so forth into it, oranges. I added a little bit of glow to her eyes into the scene, but not very much because I didn't want it to stand out too much. I initially used Oniric by Composite Nation to try to add the glow. Oniric is a third-party plugin for Photoshop that creates non-destructive glows and light flares into scenes, but ultimately Oniric just didn't give me the result that I was looking for, so I used an older technique that is the technique that I used to use to add glow a long time ago to the scene, and it's actually very simple. I went into the adjustment window here and made a solid color adjustment layer. I chose the color of orange-yellow that's in her iris, and then changed the blending mode from normal to linear dodge, and then inverted the mask so it'll be a black mask, zoomed in, and just started painting it at a flow of 10%, starting with the iris itself. So I just started painting right at the corner like this, and started building up a little bit of that glow into both sides of the iris, and then came over to this side, build up the glow, and then made my brush a little bit bigger, started building it up just a little bit more. And then I tried to add a little bit more photorealism, so I zoomed in, and on the inner eyelid at the base, I just started adding this little thin line everywhere to make it look like the actual glow was illuminating her iris. And then up here up top, I'm being very quick for the purposes of the video today. I was a little bit more careful with it. And then I made my brush really big and just dabbed it a couple of times so that ultimately we get a little bit of that sense of glow into the piece itself. Now, when I look at this base image, this one's fine all by itself. And a lot of that has to do, yes, the stock stuff put into the background, but a lot of that has to do with just the general retouch, which is why retouching to me is so important. And I often say that working in Photoshop and the retouch is 50% of the equation of photography. By doing frequency separation, dodging, and burning, and creating that sense of artistry, by adding the exposure adjustment layers and so forth to sculpt the light, this by itself is just fine. I like this piece overall too, because again, working with some of the finalizations of adding colors and so forth just gives it a little bit more of a sense of realism, but both I think are fine. It's just a question of your style. So that's it. This is the composite, and it's what, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers, 11 layers with some adjustments. So ultimately, composites do not have to be these complex machinations in Photoshop. And that's the structure and the foundation of the final thoughts I want to talk about. So let's have those final thoughts and finish up this episode of the shop vlog on the channel today. I've been creating composite artwork for a very long time in Photoshop, and some of my composites have been literally hundreds of layers, and some of them have been 3 layers. A picture of a person, a layer for them to stand on, and the sky behind them. As a matter of fact, that one that I'm thinking of won an award. Composites are a wonderful technique and way in Photoshop to tell a story. The story in the composite does not automatically mean that it must be overly complex. It's about those emotional connections. It's about design techniques and driving the audience's focus to the center of the story. Evie was the story. I didn't need to do much else. And I could have continued to add more things, more snakes and scales and sparks and all kinds of stuff. And the more that you do that, the more that it makes me think of that line from Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. If it doesn't serve the story, if it doesn't drive the audience's focus to that story, then question as an artist, do I really need to do this? Do I need to add more stuff simply because it's a composite? Should I make it more complex? And more often than not, in my opinion, the answer is no. I hope you liked this episode of the Shop Vlog. Please let me know in the comments below. Is this something that was beneficial to you, again, to continue to see me edit other people's artwork? And on that topic, I said this in part 1, my final thoughts on that too is this was a little weird for me because I'm taking somebody else's image. Now, I do a lot of freelance work for photographers. I get hired all the time to edit people's work, whether it's just a general retouch or making composites for them. And I have no problem with that because they communicate their vision to me and they've hired me to do a job. And I know that I asked people to submit images and Brad was like, hey, yo, I'll submit it. And when he sent me the picture, I'm like, oh yeah, let's do it. But there was just a part of me that felt a little weird taking his image and altering it and significantly changing it. So I'm asking you, let me know in the comments below. Is this something that bothers you? Is this something you don't like to see? Do you just want to see me edit my own artwork, or was this helpful to you in understanding my artistic process and my vision and where I would take something versus the original artist and the image maker and what they did with it? Thanks so much for watching this video. If you like the content that you found in it, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. And when you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.